she really opened up the ancient world for many readers who didn't have any education, especially in ancient Greek, but maybe not in Latin either.
Oh, it's so wonderful. And it's amazing to think nowadays there's this sort of trend of having like the public philosopher. She's sort of like the public mythologer. Who was Edith Hamilton? What were her contributions to the classics? And how can learning about her help inspire us today? Hello, my name is Anya Leonard. I'm the founder and director of Classical Wisdom, a site dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds. Today's Classical Wisdom Speaks podcast is with Victoria Houseman, the Associate Professor of History and member of graduate faculty at the University of Wisconsin at River Falls. She is also the author of American Classicist, The Lives and Loves of Edith Hamilton, of which we'll speak about today. But before I begin, a quick reminder to please go to classicalwisdom.com to check out our free newsletter or to become a member and help support the classics. Now, how exactly did the classics hold up a mirror to the going-ons of the 21st century? Well, thank you, Victoria, for joining me today. You've written a whole book on Edith Hamilton called The American Classicist, The Lives and Love of Edith Hamilton. And she's a really interesting character. And for people who know the world of classics, they might recognize her name. But there are probably plenty of our listeners who either don't know her or might enjoy a good refresher. So maybe we could start us off with, who was Edith Hamilton and why was she so influential in the world of the classics?
Yes, well, she's the author of a very well-known mythology book that was first published in 1942 and has always remained in print, and is really in many ways the most accessible and readable introduction to the subject of classical mythology. She wrote a number of other books also, which remain in print, such as The Greek Way and The Roman Way, and these have introduced thousands of readers to the ancient world.
That's wonderful. I mean, and to imagine that those books are still in print to this day, that's remarkable for the classics, the world of mythology. Why were her books so popular? Why did they kind of grab everybody's attention?
Well, I think it's her writing style, for one. She's very clear and lucid as an author. And also, I think the Greek way and the Roman way constructed parallels that made it easy for people to understand concepts such as Greek tragedy, and compared the Greek tragedians to literature that people might be familiar with from the modern world. And when she was first writing the Greek way, there weren't as many translations of ancient Greek authors as there are today. In fact, she first thought she would publish her translations of ancient Greek tragedies, and at first she found no market for them. So she really opened up the ancient world for many readers who didn't have any education, especially in ancient Greek, but maybe not in Latin either.
Oh, it's so wonderful. And it's amazing to think nowadays there's this sort of trend of having like the public philosopher. She's sort of like the public mythologer.
Yes, she really is. She was a public intellectual, and people turned to her for knowledge about the ancient world.
And so maybe you can tell us a little bit more about the actual ins and outs of her life. Like what time period, where was she born, where is she kind of popular, just sort of the bullet points, and like kind of her own personal life, because it's kind of interesting and in that time period as well.
Yes, well, she lived a very long life. She was born in 1867 and died at the age of 95 in 1963. And she was actually born near Dresden, Germany, but to American parents. And her father was from what was then a small community in northeastern Indiana called Fort Wayne. And his father had done much to develop Fort Wayne as it became an area of settlers rather than of the Miami who had lived there before. And so she was raised on this homestead in northeastern Indiana. But her father had had an excellent education and started teaching her Latin when she was about 10. And then at some point that is not delineated really, he started to teach her ancient Greek as well. And then after a brief period in a finishing school and a few years between her time at the finishing school, she started at Bryn Mawr College in 1891 and ended up getting a master's degree in 1894 and then
Which would have
studying.
been quite unusual at that time period, surely. And
Yes, Bryn Mawr College was really the first college to offer women the opportunity to get a graduate degree. And so she chose Bryn Mawr in part for that reason. So it was unusual, and the curriculum at Bryn Mawr College was very demanding, but she was an excellent student in Greek and Latin there.
that's fantastic. And this is making me feel not nearly so bad about living down here in the Pampas and teaching my daughter ancient Greek, because I'm like, okay, she maybe she'll have a future as in next Edith. So she has this kind of unique spot in time where she's sort of kind of, I think, being a conduit maybe between the public and the classics. And this is definitely something we appreciate here at Classical Wisdom, the idea of kind of bringing the classics to everybody. But did she kind of have a very unique perspective on ancient Greek history?
Yes, she did. She felt the Greeks were very near to modern people, that they could be easily understood by people living in the 20th century and sometimes living through very terrible conflicts, such as the First and Second World Wars. She described the Greeks as a modern people who used reason and applied reason to their understanding of nature and politics and the rest of the world. And while there were some 19th century writers, such as Matthew Arnold, who felt the Greeks were modern people, she really used that in the 20th century context. And again, talked about the world wars in and their relationship to the ancient world.
And so maybe we should delve into a little bit of that, because again, that's something that's very close to my heart, this idea that the classics are still very relevant to us. And I try to bring it up to our readers regularly to this day, and kind of regularly take modern situations and see, like, how can the classics help us? So how did she feel the classics could, what did the classics tell her about World War II, about these kind of huge political upheavals that were happening during her time?
She and her circle of friends very much understood World War II through the medium of Thucydides. She writes in the Greek way about the Peloponnesian War being the confrontation between a great naval power, which could be Athens or Britain, and a great land power, which could be Sparta or Germany, and the fact that an Asian nation is going to play a decisive role, whether it's Persia or the Japanese Empire. It's going to play a decisive role in the conflict. And the way that the conflict spread around the world sometimes was also understood by her circle through reading Thucydides and the history of the Peloponnesian Wars.
But so in her time period, how are these books received? How was she seen publicly, academically, at that moment and through her lifetime?
I think she experienced some success as a writer right away. The Greek Way, when it was published in 1930, did receive positive reviews, did get library sales, and her publisher, W. Norton, was very pleased with it. And Warder Norton, the head of the company, wanted her to write the Roman way right away after the Greek way was published, and she did that. And I think throughout the 1930s, her sales and her reviews tended to be quite strong, but she did remain outside academia. And it wasn't really until after World War II that I noticed academic classicists embracing her work and reviewing her work in major newspapers and magazines. And her early reviewers tended to be other writers, and sometimes other writers on the ancient world, but they tended not to be in academia. And then by 1957, when her last book, The Echo of Greece, is published, she appeared to be getting some acceptance from academic classicists. So a couple of prominent classicists, such as Richmond Lattimore and Moses Hadas, reviewed The Echo of Greece quite positively.
Oh, that must have been lovely for her.
Well, I think it really was important to personally to get that seal of approval from academia, because she had wanted to finish her doctorate and become a scholar. She always talked about the life of the scholar at the university, and instead she had ended up being the headmistress of a girls' preparatory school, the Bryn Mawr School in Baltimore, for 26 years. And she had never, of course, finished her PhD and had never been a university professor, never was a university professor.
So she also had quite a bit of criticism at some point, and I mean, I saw that there was the charge of being an apologist for Western triumphalism. I mean, how does that stand? Is that kind of a correct assessment or unjust?
I think it's a little unjust. I think she saw moral danger in triumphalism. After all, America came out on the victorious side in World War II and ended fascism, well, in most of Europe anyway. And of course, she thought the death of fascism was a good thing, but she also thought America should use its influence carefully at best. You know, the best thing that America could do was be a role model of democracy for other nations trying to achieve it at that time. And she had this very interesting conversation that I didn't have space to really include in the book with a writer named Elizabeth Sprigg. And Elizabeth Sprigg was writing the first biography of Gertrude Stein to be published after Stein's death. And Edith Hamilton told her it was all right for the British to lose their empire. So this was in the early 1950s after the departure of India. And she said to Sprigg, it's okay for the British to lose their empire if they do not lose their culture. And so I think she was not really a supporter of colonialism or empire, despite when she visited China in 1916. She did tend to assume that China would be better off if the Chinese adopted Christianity. She had some very Western assumptions when it came to China, and to some extent to Japan, though she saw the Japanese as farther advanced somehow than the Chinese. But she wasn't really a proponent of empire.
Yeah, so that this is another point I wanted to kind of discuss is that she's sort of described as a pacifist and an anti-imperialist. How did her knowledge of the classical world bring her to that conclusion? Was it correlated? Was she influenced by the classics and kind of coming to that stance?
To the conclusion of pacifism, I think she was. Both of her parents, of course, could remember the American Civil War, and her mother's experience of the Civil War was a little difficult because there were two cousins who were themselves brothers who ended up fighting on opposite sides. They certainly didn't confront each other in battle. One was involved in the Confederate defense of New Orleans, and the other one in the Union. He was a Union soldier in the Union occupation of Baltimore. But I think that was one reason she developed the idea that war was traumatic. And then she usually used as her example Euripides, the Trojan women, showing the effect of war on civilians. Or she talked about, again, Thucydides and the Melian dialogue and the Athenian treatment of the people of Melos to illustrate, again, the horrors of war.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting that's what she took away, because I suppose for some people it's kind of counterintuitive, because the ancient world so many times glorifies war. That's the moment you get to have, you can build your Cleos and your glory and everything. And you think of Achilles going out in battle, that somebody would take away those lessons as looking for the moments of the horror in it.
Yes, that's true. And she didn't write about Homer, and perhaps she didn't care for him very much because of the kind of themes you just mentioned. So yes, she did pull away, the horrors of war, Athens' terrible decline because of the Peloponnesian War, and yeah, she draws the lessons of pacifism from there. But I do think, again, it had an earlier root in her own family's history.
And what about her role as a suffragist? Would that have been impacted by the classics?
Yes, I think it was. I think it also does have a family root in that her paternal grandmother was friends with Susan B. Anthony and hosted Susan B. Anthony several times when she came through Fort Wayne, Indiana. And there's even this story that at the age of 5, she was placed on Susan B. Anthony's lap. And she, in turn, liked to tell a story about Susan B. Anthony in her old age, turning to the study of ancient Greek. But I do think she connected it to the idea of citizenship, and that the men of Athens, anyway, had once been citizens and they needed to practice good citizenship. And of course, as long as women could not vote, they couldn't be full citizens. So she inherited her interest in women's suffrage, but she certainly drew parallels to the ancient world, that women should be citizens as well. Citizens have to practice self-restraint. And she felt, as many suffragists of her era did, that if women had the right to vote, the end result would be a better society. There would be these laws about compulsory school attendance. That was really the other cause she advocated for in the progressive era. But if women had their way, if women could express their feelings at the ballot box, take part in politics, they could be full citizens and society would improve.
Well, that's, I think, an excellent point. Can I ask that when she was sort of making these parallels between the ancient world and the modern era, and kind of trying to revive the importance of the classics, was she sort of alone in doing that? Was there a lot of other people doing this? Like, why does she sort of stick out for her contributions in that regard?
I don't think there were a lot of other people. There was Gilbert Murray in England translating the plays of Euripides, and in some cases seeing them performed on the London stage. And Murray was friendly to women's rights, and it's argued he translated Euripides because he had Euripides had written these great female characters such as Hecuba and Medea, and that Euripides, really more than any other tragic playwright, had addressed some of the concerns of the 20th century. So she's often compared to him, but of course he moved in a much more academic world and had the formal education necessary to be Regius Professor of Greek at Oxford. So he lived in a different world than she did, of course. But he's the only one who comes to mind who's really constructing these parallels.
And so why should we learn so much more about Edith? Like, why bring her to the forefront now? What can she teach us?
Well, actually, what I've noticed in some of the responses to my book is her emphasis on the citizen needing to exercise self-restraint. And there's not enough of that in American politics right now. And so I think her concept of citizenship and of citizens participating in their society in constructive ways is certainly a message that resonates today. Other than that, I mean, she lived a very rich and varied life and was very accomplished. So I always admired her as I was researching and writing about her. And so I think she just makes a fascinating figure and a life that's worth retelling.
So to finish up, because you've already been so generous with your time, and I kind of want to switch it to a personal note because when I'm preparing for our discussion, I noticed that as a historian, you're not actually spend historically as much time in the classics, but more on colonial British history. So, which is kind of why then were you drawn to an American classicist? What was it about her that inspired you to kind of take such a shift?
Yes, well, she read and absorbed a lot of British Victorian writers, and it was a surprise to me to find the influence of John Ruskin in a book that was published in 1957. So she drew so much on these Victorian authors, Matthew Arnold, Benjamin Jowett, Ruskin, Pater. They're all in her work, but she was an American. So they do show how widely read someone like Arnold was in America. And I know Arnold came to America in the late 1800s and made successful lecture tours. And then it was meant to, the title was really meant to draw attention to the way that she tried to address America's condition in her writing. It's noticeable in the Prophets of Israel that she's talking about the Great Depression and how difficult that is for Americans. And again, in The Echo of Greece, perhaps most noticeably, she is talking about the ideas of Taft republicanism, or the Republicans who gathered around Robert Taft, Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, whom she knew quite well, actually. And she's talking about Joe McCarthy, Senator Joe McCarthy of Wisconsin, when she's talking about Demosthenes. And so she's addressing America's condition. So that is why I called it American Classicist. But the long-term reason I was interested in Edith Hamilton was, again, her familiarity with English literature, which she seems to have read all her life, at least back to her teenage years. She's reading George Meredith and Anthony Trollope and dreaming of being a great writer when she's still in her teens.
That I think that's just absolutely fantastic. And I think it's really important when we kind of reintroduce the ideas of sort of intersectionality, that people kind of with different backgrounds study different topics, because you end up having completely fresh perspectives on it that maybe somebody who's just been focused on the classics their whole life wouldn't see those connections. They wouldn't appreciate some of the influences she would have had from British literature. So I think it's wonderful to see different angles on this topic.
Yeah. And again, she wasn't much of an imperialist. So she doesn't have too much to say about the British Empire, just a little bit here and there. But if one studies Victorian Britain, one knows not everyone was an imperialist.
It's always a good takeaway. Well, thank you so much, Victoria, for taking out the time speaking with us today. And I'll put a link to your book, American Classicist, The Lives and Loves of Edith Hamilton, below, so that our listeners and watchers can find it for themselves and learn more about this very fascinating woman.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's been nice to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to Classical Wisdom Speaks, a podcast dedicated to bringing ancient wisdom to modern minds.